Hey, welcome to the channel where we discuss the psycholinguistics of bilingualism, otherwise known as the Dr. Duran Lopez Fan Club. Today I'll be briefly talking about the different types of bilingualism, and we're really going to narrow it down to simultaneous bilinguals and heritage speakers. So we'll focus on the topic of heritage speakers and how they operate in their heritage languages and how we can help them with those languages. And I'll be sharing a story of a friend of mine, Ana Sofia, but unfortunately she couldn't make it in person today.
Invitado enseñado en mi podcast.
So when we're talking about the different types of bilingualism, there are two main types of bilingualism. We have simultaneous bilinguals and sequential bilinguals. So we'll be focusing on simultaneous bilinguals today, and those are speakers that are often exposed to both of their languages during childhood and during that critical period. So they're acquiring those at the same time, whereas in sequential bilingualism, there is usually their first language, their L1, that is acquired during childhood, and their L2 is usually acquired later in life after the first language is already acquired. So in simultaneous bilingualism, there is exposure to both languages during childhood, like we said, and they're often at the same time during the critical period that we'll touch on later. And there are two subtypes of that simultaneous bilingualism. We have heritage speakers and balanced bilinguals. So balanced bilinguals have equal acquisition or learning of both languages during childhood, and so they're equally exposed to each language, either frequently enough or in enough areas of their lives so that one language doesn't become more dominant than the other. They have those balanced languages. In heritage speakers, however, that we'll be talking about today, they do have one language that becomes more dominant than the other. So these heritage speakers are usually children of immigrants who live in a monolingual community, but they acquired their L1 in a bilingual area or even just in a different monolingual area speaking a different language. So these immigrant families often speak in the L1 at home and everything involving their home life, but the L1 is not spoken in the community, so it becomes a heritage language. And the heritage language is the minority language for the speaker, so it is usually spoken at home, but not at school or with their friends or in their work life or wherever else they're acquiring their second language and getting that extra input in their second language that they're not receiving at home in their first language. So the phonetics of these speakers are usually monolingual-like, as their L2 becomes the dominant language for them.
So when we're talking about heritage speakers, we have to talk about Montreal 2006 and the incomplete acquisition hypothesis. The incomplete acquisition hypothesis is the idea that there is an incomplete representation of heritage grammars in that heritage language, and there are morphosyntactic errors being made by that speaker due to low frequency of that L1 input in that heritage language, and the idea of fossilization. Following her publication, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the incomplete acquisition hypothesis, and a lot of this came from Putnam and Sanchez. So Putnam and Sanchez really discussed the idea that language is never fully acquired, whether that's a monolingual, bilingual, or anyone speaking any language. So there cannot be the idea of incomplete acquisition, even in heritage speakers, because a language cannot fully be acquired at any point. There is no measure of that. They also discussed the idea that input may be as important as output, even though Montreal really focused on the idea of low input being responsible for heritage languages becoming less dominant than their second language. And finally, Putnam and Sanchez also discussed the idea that heritage speakers may reassemble features in their L1 using their L2, which would contradict the incomplete acquisition hypothesis as well. Really contradicting the incomplete acquisition hypothesis, though, would be the critical period hypothesis that we have to discuss. So the critical period hypothesis is the idea that there is a biological restraint to acquiring a language, and that languages must be acquired before the age of 9 to acquire the phonetics and morphosyntax fully. But the incomplete acquisition hypothesis really makes us reflect on the critical period hypothesis and contradicts it, because even if we acquire a language fully during that critical period, syntax may not be monolingual-like, as we see in heritage speakers. And there may be environmental factors that can influence language acquisition, not just biological constraints. Regardless of what constraints of language acquisition we may see in heritage speakers and the violations and errors made in their first language that we may see, there are a lot of struggles and difficulties that heritage speakers experience in school and in their community and in learning their first language fully or wanting to go back and learn it that we have to talk about, and that's important in our communities. So especially with children who are children of immigrant families who may speak a different language at home and go to school, they experience bullying a lot of time. And I know we also see that in my friend's story, Ana Sofia. So Ana Sofia was born in Maine and went to school in Maine, but her family moved to Colombia when she was 6 years old, 6 or 7. And even when they were living in the States here, her mom spoke Spanish at home and they spoke both English and Spanish. When they moved to Colombia, they were still speaking English and Spanish at home, but she was going to a Colombian school speaking Spanish. She had Spanish speaking friends, and she got bullied very badly at her first school for being from America and speaking English at home as well. And they had to move her to a different school to make new friends, and she really experienced that speaking Spanish and the difficulties of going to a different language school and being bullied instead of focusing on acquiring both languages and getting that education, and had to uproot and go to a different school. And that's something we see a lot of times here in the United States as well, with Spanish-speaking children being bullied and having the difficulty of learning in a different language, learning in English. They don't understand the language. They don't understand the material being taught in a different language. And they're being distracted with these social pressures of being bullied and being embarrassed for speaking Spanish at home. And that can be very difficult while learning a new language, learning school materials, trying to make friends, trying to fit in. And even with Ana Sofia, she ended up moving back to the States when she was 12 years old after that critical period ended for language acquisition. It's a little tricky with Ana Sofia seeing whether she would be a heritage speaker or a balanced bilingual, because she did come back here after that critical period ended, and she still speaks Spanish at home, and her family frequently has different guests coming in and out of the house that only speak Spanish, so she's also getting that social exposure at home that most heritage speakers do not. So I think she may be more of a balanced bilingual than a heritage speaker, but what do you think? And as we're looking at these difficulties that Ana Sofia faced as a speaker in Colombia, and that Spanish speakers and speakers of different languages face here in the States as children and even as adults in workplaces and social interactions and trying to make friends, we have to look at how we are able to help these heritage speakers in our communities, whether that is with learning, acquiring their first language, acquiring their second language, or even just making friends and fitting in socially, and how to adapt to different cultures. There are different tools that we have to help them. We can increase the amount of dual immersion schools that we have, and that would be schools and materials being taught in both languages, whether that's Spanish and English, Vietnamese and English, or whatever the speaker may be. We also have to look at the classes in schools and language classes, and ensuring that heritage speakers are not being mixed into language classes with second language learners, because there are different things that need to be taught and learned and understood. And we also have to make sure that these teachers understand language acquisition and are educated about how heritage speakers are acquiring language differently than sequential bilinguals, the children who do not speak a different language at home. Also in that, we need to encourage parents and families who are speaking the L1 at home to only speak the L1 at home, to be reading their children books in the L1 at home, to encourage them to have other friends that speak in that first language so that they have that exposure in different areas of their life to fully acquire that and acquire the grammars and the morphosyntax of their first language, and encourage them to do that and learn that, because it's a good thing to be bilingual and there are so many benefits to being bilingual. And that's not something that children should be bullied about or be embarrassed about, because that just adds extra difficulties when they're already having a bit of a harder time at school and in social interactions and adapting to different cultures. So thank you for learning about heritage bilingualism and listening in today. And I encourage you to talk to the heritage speakers in your life and learn about their experience a little bit and what they think. Thank you.